we're just opening up the session while people are starting to stream in. So I think we are ready to go. I am Gretchen Wilkins. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We have the first of our talks today for this winter semester with Nathaniel Furman. We're excited to have him joining us. I'll give a short introduction and then just turn it over to him, just to let everyone know that I'll be monitoring the Q&A. So as a webinar format, we as panelists there's not a direct interaction. So if you have questions, the best thing is there's a Q&A tab at the bottom. Just type your question in there and we'll wait till the end of the talk, probably 45, 50 minutes. Towards the end, then we'll have time to go ahead and answer those questions. You can put them in earlier or wait till the end. So, okay, Nathaniel Furman is an artist and designer of Argentine and Japanese heritage based in London. He trained in architecture and fine art and works in these fields as well as in product design and interiors. Adam is co-director of Saturated Space at the AA, the Architectural Association of London, a research group on color in architecture and urbanism, and was a studio master of Productive Exuberance, I love that, Productive Exuberance, at Central St. Martin's for 3 years. He published the book Revisiting Postmodernism for the RIBA, Royal Institute of British Architects, in 2017. Has written for many publications and won several awards, including the UK Rome Prize for Architecture, Blueprints Award for Design Innovation, and FX Product Designer of the Year. Thank you so much, Adam, for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gretchen. Hello, everybody. Now going to go to the slideshow. Productive exuberance to joyful deviance. That's I guess, pretty much the sort of smallest summary I can give in 2 words of my entire approach, which I'll take you through now in a slightly roundabout zigzag way. I went to architecture school starting in 2001, I think 2002, something like that. And I came, having come from a sort of multicultural North London background, and then come out very young, at a very young age at school in the 90s, and then been part of the sort of, not only the queer subculture of London, but sort of multiple subcultures, and especially the queer subcultures of London in the sort of late 90s. I was sort of suffused in ideas of kind of aesthetics as something that, and visual culture as something that's kind of spontaneously, but in a very sophisticated manner, embodies identity, culture, shared values in a very effusive way. And then I went to the architecture school and I was suddenly surrounded by miniature Patrick Schumachers and people wearing black turtlenecks, looking very, very depressed all the time, wishing that they were sort of Steve Jobs of architecture, and they were making models, black depressing models that looked like alien squid, or sort of 13-year-old boys' ideas of sort of like science fiction spaceships, and saying that this was what architecture had to be and this was serious and everything else was superficial and silly. And of course, I didn't really fit in there either. And it sort of was, I guess, the sort of transition from a very, very vibrant subcultural scene in I think possibly one of the most exciting periods in London's history, to suddenly being surrounded by the normativity of architecture, which is quite extreme in relation to other areas of human production. I guess gave me a very clear understanding of the arbitrary nature of a lot of the things that architects hold very, very dear as being self-evident truths, that particular aesthetics mean particular values, for instance, or are just considered good. This is one of the many memes that I used to make a while ago until I stopped making memes, but sort of making the point that effectively the kind of combined shared values of the mainstream of architecture with some small subsets tends to be just a way of fitting in and signifying your inclusion in the in crowd. And so my kind of journey through architecture school was kind of like a coming out again. It's like a third coming out. So I was coming out to my family, then there was coming out at school, which led to me being kicked out of school and horribly bullied, but then had a great time in London. And then there was a kind of third coming out in architecture school, which was frankly just as difficult, and actually has had to be repeated in the professional world after I left university. It's this kind of like perpetual recurring nightmare, like having to justify one's existence. But with a lot of joy that comes from that, from the ability to be able to do your own thing and express yourself very clearly and stand up for what you believe in. So I came out of the closet at school and started producing stuff like this when everything around me was stuff like this, you know, people talking about how architects should be replaced by algorithms. And this is my final year project at the AA, which was a church in Rome. And all the way through, you know, also the kind of 5 years before that, the projects that I was doing were always exploring these questions that were very important to me, that looked at what might be called on the outside kitsch, looking at ornamentation and how ornamentation communicates and what it means, looking at color. Color is something that's actually extremely expressive and important. Form that is kind of disassociated and freed from the expectations of the academy, which has a kind of very small subset of forms which are considered allowable because they have been repeated in the canon over an extended period of time. So you can kind of see these rather wild drawings, of which I did quite a few, as a kind of exercise in shaking free of the expectations of the weight of the canon, also the kind of peer pressure of the kind of the current vogue, or what was currently in vogue in architecture at the time, which was beautiful concrete with shadows, or everything's parametric and made by the computer. And this was something that I kind of resolutely followed through at each stage of the development of my projects, whether it was just a paper model that I was making, if it was the drawings that the sketches that I was making, or the models that I was producing. And I would try and incorporate all of the kind of aspects of making that were considered very important and serious at the time, but using them in a different way that resonated, or rather that kind of justified or explained the approach that I thought was more relevant for the contemporary world. So for instance, technology was celebrated, and everything that used technology had to look like it used technology, right? So if you produce something with a 3D printer, there was a look that said that this thing was made by a 3D printer, and therefore it was serious, and therefore it was research, and therefore it was good. So I went ahead and I was using the 3D printers, but in a wildly different way, combined with hand gold leaf painting. I was also assembling them, so I was creating whole structures out of small pieces made on the 3D printer. I was painting them, I was pigmenting them, and using them as kind of like highly expressive kind of, I guess, artifacts along the journey of design that were each pedagogical in a way. Like they were rhetorical. They were meant to make a point, even if they were just a model during the design process, which in itself is a tradition in architecture, but mine was just sort of, I guess, a bit effusive. These are just some of the models from my final year project. And also extending that out into materiality. So taking materials, and this is stuff which is just very much continued into my career, taking materials which would be normally considered so this is travertine, it's the material of Mies van der Rohe, it's the material of the construction of Rome, the kind of bones of Rome. It's the material that Ren Koolhaas has picked up as being the signifier of serious, kind of high international modernism, because it's from Mies, and it's kind of his signifier for kind of being serious, a serious modern. And I did this. So these are one-to-one voussoirs, sort of elements from the vaults of the church, which I designed in Rome, made one-to-one using contemporary technologies, but in a way that wasn't looking like, I don't know, a chair made of bird's bones or alien squid. Highly ornamental and related to the narrative of the specific project. So I had there's the whole process of kind of like coming out and arguing and explaining and justifying and standing up for the particular interests that I had, being dismissed as postmodern consistently along the way. And the sense of triumph at graduating. And then immediately after graduating, Lehman Brothers collapsed. I mean, I went on holiday, and then Lehman Brothers collapsed, which, that if any of you are old enough to remember, it was sort of like slightly like the end of the world. The international financial system ground to a halt, and people who students who I had known the year before would graduate, and within a year they designed a skyscraper in Kuala Lumpur, not themselves, but in an office, because there were so many opportunities because the world was so booming. We graduated and tumbleweed, just nothing. There was no jobs, there was no work. So I took the opportunity to do a postgrad for architecture and spatial fine arts and spatial performance, which was very fun. I got a scholarship for that, but it was very much sort of treading water for a while. In the UK, and I'm sure in the United States and everywhere, a lot of, there was a whole generation of architects who didn't have work. And so there were different groups of us who found different ways to generate work or to get together and produce culture or designs or discussions or events. And most famously, or I guess the one that sort of survived and sort of made it was Assemble, who got together in about the same time as I tried to set up an office around 2010. And they did really fantastic things, and they kind of showed what was possible in a time with very little traditional architectural work. But they all knew each other. They were from Cambridge. They all had a similar similar mindset. They spoke the same language. I mean, obviously we speak English, but they spoke about architecture in the same way. They had the same aesthetics. I mean, they kind of fit in, which is great. And I had friends in groups similar to that. But, I was dreaming of doing different stuff. Like I really wanted to, I guess, have a queer assemble. And I was always wanting to find people to work with. But I wanted to work within the world of architecture. I wanted to work with architects because I still do absolutely love architecture in the industry. I didn't want to go into events design, but I couldn't find anyone. So I had lots of friends who were doing interesting things, but everything that they did was looked like biscuits. Everything was brown, woody, socially engaged. Everyone was doing Rick Richter of Anija. They were doing pop-up kitchens and things. And we couldn't find anyone who wanted to do sort of like giant banana hats, in an outdoor nightclub that was architecturally intriguing and related to theory. So I ended up working, luckily. So it didn't last, the sort of sojourn didn't last too long, and I managed to get some really fantastic architectural positions in London, and worked on some really random, slightly random things. On the left, there's the Serpentine Pavilion for Rem Koolhaas. I was there as Ome for a bit. And on the right is a building that just won Best Skyscraper of the Year for CTBUH, which is the skyscraper organization in Chicago, which I worked on for Ron Arad in Tel Aviv, amongst other projects. But while I was doing those jobs and learning and sort of getting experience and getting a salary, which is fantastic, I never sort of never gave up the kind of the idea that I wanted to be out there producing the kind of work that I was really interested in, that other people were, perhaps in very kind ways saying perhaps you shouldn't pursue because, it's aesthetic, it's superficial, it's silly, you need to only be talking about politics and then have the aesthetics of political architecture or socially engaged architecture if you want to do anything nowadays. But, I nonetheless didn't know what I was doing, but I was just every night making stuff. I was either making models or I was coming up with all kinds of random projects, like some of the ones that you can see on the screen, trying to find, little project here and there that I could do with a friend, a proposal for the British Pavilion, which is actually the Biennale, which is on the bottom left there, which is understandable we didn't get that because it was a proposal to reveal the underlying bitchiness behind British architecture. I can understand why they didn't choose us. But I think it would have been good, stylistic. So representing it stylistically with words. And while I was starting to eventually, I guess throwing like those little sticky men that fall down the walls. If you throw it, they go. Sometimes they don't stick. So I think from very early on, from around 2010, I was sort of throwing many things at the wall. During the day I was moving toilets around on Revit, and then in the evening I was chucking stuff on the wall, trying any opportunity I could come across to see what would stick, while also then starting to teach. This is a course that I taught at the with Marco Ginex, who's my boyfriend, at the Architectural Association in 2010, 11. It was making one-to-one, so 1.5 meter by 1.5 meter ceramic walls from scratch. And the only, it was called digital ceramics because the only way you could get a course or get something at the time was by calling it digital. So we just called it digital ceramics. And yeah, I mean, people designed on Rhino, but then they had to create the mold, and then they had to sort of cast, then they had to fire, then they had to glaze, then they had to mechanically assemble, so not wet fix the tiles together. It's an incredibly laborious process. But through that kind of combination of technology and craft, together with the process of each of the students kind of exploring their own ideas of aesthetics in relation to the vehicle for that was personal memories, produced the most, frankly, really absolutely mind-blowing walls of high-quality ceramic tiles, which were then thrown into a garbage skip and smashed to pieces by mistake by the Architectural Association maintenance team, which was very nice of them. And slowly started to get small commissions, which thankfully, because of working all the time in practices, which initially was unintentional, right? I had to do it. I didn't necessarily want to. I had hoped to set up a practice with other people. Turned out to be an incredible positive because I was learning kind of on the job all kinds of practical experience at the expense of my bosses, because any mistakes that were made would be on their, on their time and with their clients, and learning a lot of skills. And then on the side, it meant that I could take on projects that were only of great interest and absolutely fit exactly what I was interested in exploring for my portfolio or with my specific areas of personal research and interest. So I never did projects for myself that I never found interesting. And that was a very great luxury. Now I look back on it. At the time, I was frustrated. And this was one of the first one, which was for a small wedding pavilion. The couple and the family stand on here and get married. And it's a typical sort of, young architect, young designer trying to do too many things in a small project, sort of little manifesto of how to, I guess at the time it was like how to use lots of different technologies, material technologies in a really sensual and sensually expressive way. So looking at 5 and 3 axis machine milling on the wood columns and showing them as a sort of like melange of different historical references. The floor is layers of water jet cut rubber, and then on the top is sublimation dye silk screen, and then acid etched on the sides, and sort of every little element of it, not being very expensive, but kind of celebrating the sensual possibilities of fabrication technologies at the time. I later learned to be able to actually make sure that I got good photographs of my projects afterwards, but unfortunately I only learned that after about 10 projects, which is really frustrating. This is another one with really bad photographs. And even, so even small projects that I was working on, I would treat them as if they were a larger scale thing. So this was an entry for the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition. Sorry, my dog wants to be picked up. These are pushing 3D printing technologies at the time to be as large as they possibly could, while imagining them at a larger scale. I think you can see creeping in here a kind of humanistic body referencing set of aesthetics, which starts to crop up in my work more and more often. Hang on one second. And so I was making objects. This video should, okay, there's a video here of people taking this glazed out of the kiln. I'm not sure why it doesn't work. Anyway, and the commissions initially were normally very small at the scale of objects, but that's not really a problem, or that wasn't a problem at all for me, because in any case, I think my perception of space, design, and architecture has always effectively been a collection of objects. So objects, a space, rather than being an abstract, extensive thing which is sort of mathematically divided for eternity, and which has just light and shadow and maybe very, very insubstantial or very, very beautifully, subtly cast concrete and materials framing its extents. I actually think of it, I think that that's a really exclusionary way of thinking of the world that erases all differences. And so for me, space is actually a collection only of meaningful things, of objects, which without us, or without nature doing its equivalent of that, there is no space, because space for me is things which have meaning collected together over time to create culture. Space is kind of like, I guess for me, the domination of the architect over everything and everybody, and their erasure on behalf of him or her. Yes, anyway, so each of these objects for me was really, actually wonderful, because in any case, for instance, when I was studying at architecture school, I was an antiques dealer for the whole time that I was at university, and I got very obsessed with porcelain. This was the largest 3D printed glazed ceramic in the world at the time. Unfortunately, it went to be shown in Portland, in Oregon, and it got dropped, so it smashed into 1,000 pieces, which is very sad. So it's no longer the world's largest 3D printed glazed piece of ceramic. However, the insurance money was very nice, so I won't complain about that. Oh, there it is. So now smashed into lots of pieces. This is about 1 meter high. So it's small. It's not architectural, but it's substantial as a kind of in-between scale, which is something I was doing quite a lot. And this notion of the object is kind of embedded in, I guess, an issue of identity for me that's very much kind of in relation to the notion of coming out, and I guess my background both as an immigrant, or as a child of immigrants, and as a sort of queer individual who grew up in London. And so for me, there's a series of scales through which I think of everything that I work on. And on the one hand, so the kind of the initial scale is, if you're somebody who has been born into a body which society doesn't necessarily that society does not celebrate, that society dislikes, or you're born into a body which wants to do things with other bodies which society dislikes and doesn't celebrate. There's a kind of uncomfortableness that, let's say, very athletic straight man in the changing room doesn't have, right? There's a kind of there's a lack of safe. You do not feel safe the way somebody else might in the outside world with you just as you were born, because of culture to the exterior. So the body and the closet and the mirror become extremely important in the construction of identity as a sort of as a empowering act in these circumstances. So the coming out of bringing your body, choosing clothes from the closet, or we say cupboard, choosing clothes from the cupboard, which then construct your identity as you wish it, so that you feel empowered in front of the mirror, whose specularity allows you to construct yourself with a sense of ownership over you, who's otherwise been told that you don't fit in by everyone else, is a really empowering and wonderful thing. So it's this sort of the body and the clothes. And this is something, it's part of it's a biological sort of necessity that people have always had from an early age, from the beginnings of humanity, or the beginnings of culture. We have tattooed ourselves. We have modified our bodies. We have pierced ourselves. We have always changed ourselves to conform with who we wish to be. That is completely normal. And so the closet for me is this very empowering moment. And it was, I guess, growing up. And then there's the room. And the room is equally important. And it's through the objects that you then accrue and accumulate to externalize that identity that you're constructing. You're then starting to create a world which is mirroring and making safe that which you are creating through yourself. So it's this construction of a world of objects, the exteriorization of identity in the room, which is the next stage. And then further to that, there's going out into the public realm and expressing that sort of discovered and constructed identity to the outside world. So it's kind of these series of scales which run through all of my work. This is something which is universal. So I've had this experience, it's very powerful. If you go into the living room of someone who you don't necessarily know, who has recently passed away, no matter what, no matter how undesigned it is, unless they've never lived there, but if they've lived there for a long time, it is extremely powerful. They don't need to be a designer, just the disposition of objects on the shelves, just the things on the mantelpiece, the way that the photographs have been organized, the type of technology that they have, the way that the type of porcelain that they have, the birthday cards that they've kept over the years. It's an incredibly powerful and overwhelming sense of somebody's entire personality being conveyed in one go. And it's quite an emotional thing. And that's a kind of raw moment of that human impetus that we have to express and externalize ourselves, which from the very beginning, happened in caves. What did we do? We painted the caves. The moment we started to create shelters with woven fabric, we started to create different types of weaves, which symbolized and represented different things, aspects, values, mythologies, social hierarchies. Jewelry is the next step. We start to adorn ourselves. And so this externalization is fundamental to human nature. And I guess with regards to sort of minimalism modernity, all that is it's the externalization of the dominant group in a particular moment in human history who oppress and exclude everybody else's expression. That's an opinion, it's not a fact. And when you're a designer or an artist or a collector, you are doing that much more actively. So this is Madeleine Vriesendorp, fantastic artist, who lives next to where I went to primary school, who collects kind of tchotchkes from all over the world. And the act of collecting in a more conscious way, all it does is it kind of ramps up the degree of potency of that action. And this is something that's been codified in architectural academia for a long time. There's the Cabinet of Curiosities, the Wunderkammer, which goes all the way back to Lorenzo Medici's Studiolo, where he could show all of his learning and the knowledge that he had and the arts and his his great sophistication with all the art around him externalized in his small studiolo. And it's something which is today very present in television, in popular culture. There's an understanding in set design and in art direction that this is a very important thing to bear in mind, and it has occasionally erupted into the world of fine architecture, academic architecture. With Charles Moore being the great interloper, I guess. It's a fantastically interesting and queer character who somehow managed to basically be at the very top of American, world architectural academia for many decades, slipping in incredibly transgressive design tactics under the radar, but whose natural tendency was was very much this sort of externalization of an identity which otherwise, I guess in his early years was not very welcome in the United States. And with a designer, I think this is the same with the objects that a designer produces over the course of their life. So if you think of it, the designer's life and everything that they've made in a way that there's a kind of living room of the designer's life spread all over the world. So expressing who they are over time, with each of the objects being a slice in time of that designer. And in 2013, after sort of lots of throwing at the wall and lots of trying things, some of which happened, some of which didn't, I was given the position of design in residence at the Design Museum in London, which is an incredible program for supporting every year 4 people from a different field to be given a platform to kind of do their own research and to create a project, which is then shown in the museum to a ridiculous number of people. It's a very popular museum. And that's the theme in 2013, which was the last year that I was eligible, was identity, which was surprisingly perfect for what I was interested in. And I did my proposal, and then the project was based on something that I do quite often for myself, which was I would create a character. So I'd create a story, which for me acts as a way of like a Greek mask. So in Greek theatre, you have a mask which you put on, and that allows you to be the character much more than you would be without it, because it severs the relationship between yourself and who you are and the kind of projected image. And in a way, doing the same thing for a project for me, creating a character and a narrative allows me to actually be more me than I would otherwise be, but a very focused me, and who is liberated to be a bit ridiculous, I guess, or extreme through that situation. And I created one who would explore the paradigmatic situation of a designer a young designer in the 21st century using technology as a mode of identity expression. I did that by locking him in his room for 3 months, like a Japanese hikikomori. And every day he had to create an object. And that object had to be created either at home, so like I would with clay, or it had to be able to be delivered from the internet, so basically 3D printed or something along the lines of 3D printed or milled. And every single day he had to design an object, and that object was to be because he was so lonely and frustrated, that object was became the encapsulation. Rather than having a function, it would be the encapsulation of a situation he was living through in his life. So Facebook envy, or generalized anxiety, or like him trawling through his ex-girlfriend's photos on Instagram from like 5 years before and then mistakenly clicking on one, or like a weird obsession he developed on YouTube for like a really low res 16-bit reconstructions of ancient Carthage. All very different, but like all would turn into both a story and a narrative that I would write, but then also an object. Yeah, he fell in love with his vase, which is very true, because I very much do love that vase. It's very much the most beautiful thing that I will ever own, and I'm always terrified that it's going to break, especially because I got kicked out of 2 flats over COVID and we had to move, which was a nightmare. But each of those stories would turn into an object, and that object was then created. And I was, for 3 months, I was going mad. I was actually living this, because I was the only one who was working full time, and I was working full time in an architecture practice. And then I'd go home and I'd literally like all night, just like take loads of Pro Plus, which is like caffeine pills, and just be like designing these objects and writing these stories. And by the end, he dies. So he has a heart attack because too many caffeine pills, which basically I felt like I was dying. And a little bit like, there's living rooms that I talked about, artist studios are very often, or sometimes, taken by art museums, art galleries, and museums, as they are when the artist died. So Francis Bacon's is like that, Eduardo Palozzi's is like that. They convey the entire atmosphere, right? The entire personality and kind of spirit of the artist comes across with those studios, which are just brought en masse for the purposes or for the kind of expressive reasons that I was explaining before to the museums. And I did the same with this guy. So I did like the 21st century kind of millennial designer, his studio in the design museum, and kind of all of these zillions of objects were kind of brought and put. I would have liked it a lot messier, but within what was allowed with the curator of the design museum to put them in that context. And this kind of shows the journey of everything that I work on now, the kind of process, which is that there's research and there is narrative and there's story, but that the actual end result is always just expressive. So it's just an atmosphere which is conveyed non-linguistically and non-didactically, but there's more behind it if you should so wish to know about it. So that was a project which was very important for me to reach people, but it was also a bit of a manifesto, so, talking about how objects, technology, can be related to contemporary identity and cultural issues and questions through visual culture and form. And that's something that I pursued quite unapologetically, and I still do through attempted failed commercial means. I've been dismissed as vulgar capitalist by a certain Italian left-wing intellectual architect, even though I've literally lost money on all of these because I'm a complete failure of a capitalist. But regardless, I tried and would always kind of create these objects, which I would consider as sort of stages on my journey. Including crowdfunding, which these were crowdfunded. These are ceramic lamps, and exploring, starting to explore through those objects also broader issues that I was very interested in, like questions of queerness, which was when I was young. Queerness as a kind of topic area, it's very new, or it's relatively new in the world of design. So the kind of discussing it as an entity in itself kind of started out for me over the past 5 years, which was very nice. It felt like a bit like a coming out, because I'd been ridiculed by certain members of the profession and had some difficulty sort of explaining my approach. And it was very nice to be able to actually couch my dialogue, or sort of the expression of my approach to other people in the professional world as being from within the ken of a kind of queer approach, and then starting to kind of systematically break it down and explain what that meant. And objects was a really fantastic way of kind of testing those ideas at a small scale, which was, it didn't require a client. It didn't really require a client who would be absolutely horrified at the idea of having, a soft pink living room. And doing the same thing through furniture. And again, so here you can see, and they're starting to crop up more and more, but kind of anthropomorphic, sort of humanistic aspects of graphically representing different ambiguous moments from the human body, which signify both male and female always, and also neither. Is something that I now really enjoy putting into all of my projects. So this is some furniture that I did last year. I just wanted to mention this because I got the commission by pitching to the client for the chair on the right, saying that I will design for you a chair that wants to eat your bum right up. And the client was Italian and found that utterly hilarious. I'm going to have to speed up. I will try to do so. Souvenirs. So thinking about objects is, it's something, there's a very long tradition of this, right? And there's a very long tradition actually of thinking of cities as objects and objects as buildings, buildings as cities, cities as collections of objects. But going back to Rome, which is pretty much my favorite place in the entire world, it was kind of a fulcrum of where the kind of tourist idea of souvenir really took off. It was something that kind of originated in pilgrim routes, with people taking a relic, a sort of a trace of a relic back with them. But it's something in Rome which became a kind of commercial collapse of an entire identity of a city as something that could be purchased and taken away. And they got very precise about, in Panini, or I think that's his name, that the artist on the left kind of produced, huge, wonderful paintings, which people could take back, which were highly realistic. But for the less wealthy, they would make small objects, which became very scientific about the level of information and abstraction which they would have, just the right amount of information to trigger the imagination, or and bring up thoughts about this fantastic city and this building, but not too much that it becomes too complicated and expensive. And there's kind of amazing precise science there of creating objects which are synecdoches, right? They represent something much bigger. And they do that without explaining themselves, without words. And Rome itself has been, theorized as a place of imaginary objects for millennia, but especially since the 17th century. And it's a place where people from all over the world have visited. They have gone there, and they have reimagined it. So, you have people from all of the major cultures of the world have gone to Rome. They've drawn it, they've written about it, and they've not misunderstood it, but they have transformed it through their own particular perspective. A famous one being Piranesi. This is the Via Appia and all of the tombs. Obviously, this is not realistically a reconstruction of ancient Rome, but this is how he imagined it. And each of these people, through their imaginary reconstructions of Rome, all of these fantastic artists would then influence Rome itself. And it's a city that has actually been, its real physical fabric has been hugely influenced by the imaginary reconstructions of lots of artists who have then captured the imagination of future generations of architects. So, for instance, Piranesi hugely influenced a lot of architects who then went on to build in other cities around the world, but also to rebuild Rome. This is Brasini. It's a fantastic, it's a humongous church. He did a lot of projects in Rome, which is, what you can see is massively influenced by Piranesi's kind of Baroque use of ruinations. It's absolutely incredible stuff that transformed whole areas of Rome. Similarly, Giorgio de Chirico is another example. He came to Rome and loved the city, but he would not paint the buildings. So he would not go out into the city to paint. I think he went once to the Colosseum. Like, he would buy tourist toys, and then he would paint the tourist toys because he felt that those souvenirs and those toys represented the city in a way better than he ever could. And those paintings that he produced of this abstracted Rome based upon toys then became the blueprint of real Romanità, like what true Roman architecture, which was then copied by the fascist architects in the 1930s, who demolished whole areas of actually real original Rome and then built Giorgio de Chirico's Rome based upon tourist toys upon it, and then also a whole new area of the city down in Eur. So there's this kind of wonderful dynamic between the imagination and people visiting the city and its actual physical fabric, which is something that when I won the Rome Prize for Architecture in 2014 to 15, I wanted to do my own version of that. And that was my proposal, which bizarrely won. They're normally quite conservative, which amazingly won me the prize for that year, and I got to be in Rome. And this is the result. So I produced a project where I went into the city and I found stories. Now, by this point, looking from a queer perspective, so looking for historiographies and narratives and stories and case studies which were ignored by the canon, but which were fascinating. And Rome is full of them. I mean, literally almost every other building you come across, you can find something interesting. And what I did was I started to find stories which kind of tied in. It's confirmation bias, but like I would find stories that tied into my ideas, and I would write them up, I would research them, and they were actually published on the Architectural Review every 2 weeks. And then I would also design them. So I'd kind of create designs. This is the story of a church in West Africa, which is based on the St. Peter's, but it's so big you can fit St. Peter's inside. And from these kind of imaginary scenarios, started to construct an alternative Rome for myself, which is kind of like a cohesive kind of alternative world, which was both interior and exterior. But it's thinking about stories as objects. So I'm thinking of the city as a kind of collection of stories, which are actually then objects because they're designed. This is a story about Valentino having a face-off with McDonald's, with the first McDonald's in Italy, and the bitch fight of the two Reds back in, I think, 1986. These were then turned into, so the process of abstraction is very important. I think in architecture, there's a tendency to get over complex, or complicated rather than complex, with shapes and forms. And kind of, I would then go through a process of hand drawing to try and reduce each of these stories into something which was as souvenir-like as possible, right? As kind of as reduced set of forms as possible, which would then turn into a souvenir object. So again, it's this kind of process of going out into the city at big scale, going back into history, going into computer at great complexity, and then bringing everything back down to kind of a very simple, very, very simple souvenir level, working with ceramics. And each one of these are emblematic, or I guess imbued with the story and the design of one of the kind of alternative historiographies that I did before. And in the end, I created this alternative Rome. So that basically this is my version of, it's my version of Piranesi's Iconographiam Campi Marti, which if you don't know is a fantastic plan of his imaginary Rome, which you should check out. And this is my version of it in kind of set of souvenir objects. And then obviously there's lots of writing and there's lots of stories aside from that. There's a kindred spirit that I have. It says my internet connection is unstable. It's gone away.
Adam, I'll just jump in and say you have about 10 or 15 minutes.
10 or 15 minutes. Okay, tell me at 5, and then.
Okay, will do.
So this is okay. So John Soane's museums, kindred spirit, blah blah blah. I got to show it in the Sir John Soane Museum. It was fantastic, and the Sir John Soane's Museum commissioned me to produce a new sculpture for them, which is now the biggest 3D printed glazed ceramic sculpture in the world. So it's fine. I have the I don't know what is it, the Guinness World of Records thingy-majiggy. But as you can see, this is a kind of use of classical language, which is something that I very often use because the alternative history of classical architecture is something as a kind of way for queer people to hide in plain sight. And then similarly with modernity is something that's very important to me. I started a Facebook group on it years ago, which was very interesting for a while, but it's gone tits up. That word in English is not a bad word, but okay. Anyway, I would move up. So working, and then I worked with significantly larger objects through time. Just quickly on the topic of color, color is something which I have taken quite seriously. It's something which from very early on, it was around me as a child a lot. I have a very eccentric family. In the queer scene, it was color everywhere in the 90s. I don't know if you guys know London, but there was like a 60s revival. It was very, very bright and colorful, kind of techno 60s revival at the time. And it's something that I needed to justify because it was something that you get attacked using a lot in architecture. And I set up with Antoni Malinowski Saturated Space at the AA in 2011, and we've published many, many texts. We've had 9 symposia, lots of lectures, teaching as well on the subject, which has been able to sort of move the discussion on in architecture to incorporate color, taking it seriously as an active agent, as something that's expressive of like socio-cultural, political issues, but as well as being a phenomenologically important aspect of design. I've worked with amazing people at Saturated Space, which is great. And I've explored color very often explicitly using the terms such as drag. So this is a drag piece. This is a drag piece. Or gender fucking. So like specifically, I guess, playing with gender expectations through color and then mixing them up. This one is drag. It's a kind of taking early 20th century fascist architectural elements which are popular in the United Kingdom. Arches. Everyone was using arches because of the Palazzo della I can't remember, Civiltà Italiana, I think, building in Rome. But they were not critically using it. They didn't understand where they came from. And so this is a kind of bit of a piss take, I guess. And I took elements from fascist facades that were very famous, that people were referencing a lot in London, and I dragged them. It's a little bit like the way I described it was putting makeup on and a wig on Mussolini and making him present on the balcony dressed like that. And it's something that and color is now fundamental to each of my projects. And on each project, I kind of think about what the nature of it is, who the audience is, and what message I want to convey linguistically, but what atmosphere and audience I want to feel the right feelings from it. That's a project in Tokyo. This is a project in Bristol. This is again, I think you can see quite clearly the kind of way I'm thinking of also the interiors that I do as a collection of objects which I insert into existing spaces. There's a polemical discussion here about heritage because it's a listed building and I covered all of the heritage stuff in white paint. That's a project that endlessly ongoing. And ornament. So the final kind of topic area is ornament, which is really important to me because it's mixing cultures and the kind of fluidity between nations and cultures is really, really important to me, especially in a period where both on the left and the right, on the left, some people are shutting down cultural sharing through a misunderstanding of cultural appropriation. And then on the right, we have a lot of pressure to stay British and stay native and kind of stick with what's yours. And both have a kind of slightly kind of extreme understanding of what cultural exchange really is about. And ornament, like food, is one of the things which nobody can control, and it really does move between cultures. This is an example here of chinoiserie and then Rococo in relation to porcelain manufacturing, export and import between China and Europe, and how white China would be imported to Europe, which would then be decorated by the Europeans in a style that they thought was Chinese, which would then sometimes make it back to China. The Chinese thought that that's what the Europeans wanted, so they would then decorate it in that style, which would then go back to Europe, and then the Europeans would then be like, oh my God, this is the new Chinese style. And it kind of, Rococo developed in this kind of like crazy backwards and forwards misunderstanding between cultures. And it's that kind of fluid exchange that happens that I really love in ornamentation, especially because my background's a complete mix as well. And I don't really understand people who sort of stick within these boundaries. I think the celebration of fusion is wonderful. Oh, fusion, none of you will remember the early millennium obsession with fusion food, which was terrible. That's not really what I mean. But yeah, ornamental motifs such as these, which kind of fly around the world with incredible rapidity and don't have origins the way that some people on the internet would like you to think. They kind of belong to everyone, and everyone who changes them owns them as much as anyone before. And sometimes I get projects where I get to look into ornament. And this is a project where I was sort of looking at three different ornamentation traditions in Eastern Asia, which I then brought together with Italian ornamental traditions. There's a whole story behind this, but I'm just going to go very quickly through. You get the idea of kind of mixing and then bringing together in a contemporary palette, and it's the idea of sort of like a contemporary Marco Polo, but where the balance of power is towards East Asia, and then creating things which are very evocative and kind of speak for themselves effectively. And then this is a more recent collection. I've also, just to quickly mention, I've also been very active in terms of advocacy. So I'm quite outspoken. I have been. I've been trying very hard not to be over the past year, but I have been in the past quite outspoken about various issues, and sort of catalyzed quite a lot of change on certain ones. One being the preservation of postmodern architecture in the UK. We had very little of it, and most of it was being destroyed. And I started a lot of different things, in 2011 onwards, and effectively got the first postmodern building in the UK listed, and then got the first ever stylistic review by Historic England of the style over the whole country, and actually got a whole bunch of buildings listed, and moved the debate on from people celebrating postmodern buildings being built because they hated demolished because they hated so much, to now actually the language, both in terms of kind of government bodies having the language to be able to justify sort of listing them, to also the language in the public in the architectural debate being present there to sort of protect them. This spread to multiple other countries. I know lots of people don't like Philip Johnson because he was a Nazi, but I reserve the right to like his architecture as a Jew. And they were damaging his building. But there are many other postmodern buildings in the United States which are sort of being preserved as well. But that's now spreading to lots of other countries. And I wrote this book with Sateri, which kind of put all of those points down and caused a lot of debate. And I've also been quite active. I'm aware, Gretchen, that it's my time, so I'll be very quick now. Speaking about, I guess it's not just queer aesthetics, but I guess the ability, the real nature of, or the lack of aesthetic and symbolic representation and diversity in the architectural profession, and how people, when they come into it, you may be queer, you may be from a different ethnic background, and if you manage to make it into the profession, which is hard enough, if you manage to make it into making stuff in the profession, you're expected to leave. You can be what you want, maybe at home, but you cannot express that symbolically in any of your work. So you have to effectively do a sort of Faustian pact where you leave your identity at the door when you come into the profession, which is something I've talked about a lot. I won't talk about this now, but it's a very, very queer chair. You can imagine there's lots of naughty symbolics there. And this is a project in Australia. Gretchen lived there. This is in Melbourne, which is currently at the triennial at the National Gallery Victoria at the entrance. And they sort of commissioned me to queer the entrance space, about 400 square meters. This is sort of a very good example of like a gender fuck palette. Like it's an ice cream swirl of colors which are used to represent different gender groups as children. But similarly, also the ornamentational forms and also the graphical symbols there are always ambiguous, sort of bi-gendered ambiguous references to bodies which are non-sexual. And yes, there's some more advocacy. And similarly, like I try to work at a larger scale, and slowly, these are sort of visionary projects, imagining a larger scale, but I've always been trying to bring my stuff into the urban realm. And slowly from objects, I'm starting to be able to do objects in the city, as well as interiors, which are made of objects. You can see here gateways, which are kind of they're very much along the same approach as my previous work, which was just in small objects. And similarly, this is in a hotel. as well, and I do products which are now actually commercially available, and I do make money from, which is quite nice, unlike before. But very much so. This is an ornamental exploration of the Mediterranean, and some handles. Sorry, 3 minutes over. This is just a collection of objects which I've recently put out for a new materials company in Glasgow called Miral. That's kind of really interesting process. It's a new material. It's kind of interesting resin mix. And then that's the end. I'm sorry, I slightly went over there.
Not at all. That's fine. Absolutely fine. It's just to have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Which we do have. Thank you so much. That was just an amazing description and understanding of your work, and just visually beautiful. We have our first question from Michael McLeod. Answer live. You've spoken persuasively about the process of abstraction. What should we keep in mind about the limits of abstraction?
So I don't know. 1 second. So, sorry, she's annoying me.
Pet guests always welcome.
Yes, it's a friendly spaniel. Limits of abstraction. Are they allowed to speak? Because I'd like to understand the question a bit better.
I don't think they can. But Michael, if you want to follow up, you could type in a bit more, and we could have a chat in the meantime. If you can ask a bit more, articulate more about what you're after. And in the meantime,
right.
As others type in, I was thinking, I just thought it was a really fantastic way that you talked about otherness and empowering, like in your own process, and maybe more broadly, like how do you empower that otherness? Because it requires both understanding that sort of your own identity, as well as whatever that dominant mode or dominant group is. And that's not always easy to do, especially when you're a student and you don't always know what you're being taught and how to understand it being dominant or not. So I thought that was really interesting, and the process of establishing a sort of character and a narrative in order to play out different modes of that. So I guess I was just wondering, in your process since then, like, do you find that you develop different characters, like you put on these different masks in order to either realize or invent different others, different dominant groups that you're responding against? Or Is there like...
No, I rather than sort of, I guess, creating versions of dominant groups which vary from place to place and time to time, it's rather it's a way for me to give myself more power. You know, I'm sort of quite, you know, fundamentally, as a sort of, you know, kid who was badly bullied and, you know, didn't fit in any way. Like, I'm fundamentally, I feel like an imposter always, and I'm, you know, have self-confidence issues, which are not helped by the fact of people always questioning you and not thinking, you know, talking behind your back and stuff.
Of course.
And actually, what the sort of the mask, or I guess the narratives, have done, which is something that I developed at university, actually as a tool, was it allows me to separate myself. So it's kind of like, it is me, but it's not me. It's a part of myself which is going on a journey. And actually, it can take all the flack, and it can be really extreme in a way that I would be too shy to be, possibly. And the project could go much further and much wilder than maybe, if I felt it was really me, I would ever have the confidence to do. So it's a little bit, you know, it's like the tactic of dressing up, that, you know, you can be perhaps someone that you felt was always suppressed. If you dress up, you know, the real you possibly gets released. And it was, looking back on it, right, this wasn't the intention. It was the same kind of thing. And it was a tactic that I fell upon. I remember just trying, I was super unhappy at various points. And I remember trying different ways to be able to produce work that I found meaningful. And this was, I mean, I remember trying this technique, and it just, you know, after kind of moving through, sort of like sludge, you know, sort of like concrete really slowly. And then suddenly trying this technique, which was, I think it was at the beginning of my third year. It was like suddenly going from moving through concrete to just taking off on a rocket.
Right.
I mean, literally, I mean, my work just overnight just transformed. It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And, you know, that, I guess it's a matter of what works for everyone, but that sort of dressing up and that sort of, yes, it's me, but actually it's someone else. And, you know, I don't get hurt and I don't care what people think.
Right.
Because it's me.
Right.
It was very important for that stage of my life, and actually for a period of my professional life. I mean, at this point, I'm sort of slightly beyond that.
Right. Sure. Still fun.
Possibly.
What's that?
Possibly. There are actually some things which I find difficult to deal with, which actually, if I got, for instance, an artist residency of good duration, I would probably actually do exactly the same thing, but with those issues now.
Right. Just Michael's followed up on his question about abstraction. So
sorry, Michael, for
I'm thinking that things can be gained or lost through abstraction. For example, something that is too abstract might not be relatable or commercially viable.
Well, I mean, commercial is a different thing, but I guess the section about ornamentation is, I could talk an hour about it, and within that discussion, there is a question of meaning, right? Because I think a lot of people they consider ornamentation as a way of communicating, which is not which I linguistically communicating, and I don't think of it that way. And for it to linguistically communicate, ornamentation needs to be tied into something which we culturally share, which we all culturally know. So, for instance, ornamentation in the Catholic Church was codified in relation to stories which everybody knew, and there were significations that everybody understood. And similarly, in the French Republic, the French, whatever the third, I don't know, Napoleon III's French something or other of the late 19th century, it was codified in a national sense so that everybody understood the ornamentation as being guided by a government body. And people want that. They want things to tell them. So a lot of designers want to tell people things. And you can do that with great abstraction if everybody knows what the reference is. So for instance, corporate logos, if everybody knows Amazon, everybody knows Google, everybody knows the colorways that they use, and they can automatically recognize them. And that's a kind of form of contemporary shared meaning, which can be very abstract. But if you want to linguistically communicate with people about something which not everyone knows without people having to read a letter to understand it, you kind of need to explain it. So very often you need to go back to early church where they have to do a whole explanation through, people moving and explaining the story in a strip. you have to go back to that to explain it, because there isn't the shared value or the shared meaning, right, that everyone knows that you're telling. But that's not what I'm interested in. So what I like to do is I create impressions and atmospheres. So yes, okay, there's stories and stuff behind it. With me, it's more like I want to do a slap in the face, or I want to do a kiss on your eye through my ornamentation. You know, and it's about that effect. It's about, and that's actually just one quick story. There's like a really interesting example where in Suriname, there was a guy who wrote, there were the people who make these sort of beautiful ornamented objects. And there was an ethnographer who went, an anthropologist who went there, and he was like, what, you know, he was writing a book on them. And he said, figurative forms, not figurative, what do these abstract ornamental forms mean? And they were like, they don't mean anything. No, they don't mean, we've been doing these for like thousands of years, and they don't mean anything. We make them, we do what we like. And he was really sort of annoyed. And he went back to Holland, and in Holland he wrote a book, and he made up meanings for all of the different, you know, he did a kind of lexography or whatever, of like what all of the different patterns meant. And what happened was that these people were selling them to tourists. These people never had, or the community that they were from never had such good business, because all of the tourists would go to them with the book and be like, oh, Jonathan, look, this means that. And then they'd buy it. Suddenly, it had value in the eyes of Dutch tourists. Right. And there's a kind of valification, there's a kind of very masculine idea of depth that is required for something to have sort of linguistic meaning. Right. And that we can get this whole discussion about the surface here and depth being valued and whatever. But yeah, so abstraction, I think for me, there's two different types. And for me, the abstraction can be any type, and it doesn't matter how extreme it is, if it gives you the slap or it gives you the kiss. Right.
That's a great way of putting it. There's another question from Donna Sink. It was lovely to see Charles Moore in your lecture. I'd love to hear you dish on the work of Venturi or Zumthor, etc., or anyone else currently in the news. Whose current work do you like recently? Who are you looking at now? Whose work do you like currently?
What does dish mean? Sorry, I think it's American.
I wasn't actually sure. Talk about, celebrate, criticize.
So who do I really like? I mean, to be honest, like I kind of, so I put it this way, like I appreciate everything that's had thought put into it. So like, to be honest, anything that a designer has put thought into, anything that an architect has put a thought into, it's such a miracle that anything, I mean, when you guys all go out into the industry, you'll understand it's such a miracle that anything actually gets done that's not rubbish.
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
It's really, really tough.
Right.
I genuinely appreciate almost anything, as long as it's not objectively exclusive, damaging, dangerous, harmful. You know, if there's something that can be quantifiably and objectively problematic, then yeah. Otherwise, I tend to find something that I really like almost everywhere. Now, love is a very different matter. I don't love very much. That's extremely rare, and I have a sort of, you know, I have my own. That's why I sort of started developing my own sort of, I guess, historiography when I was at university, because I felt so alone. Like I couldn't find anyone who was doing stuff my age or around me that was doing stuff that I found parallels with. I mean, there was people doing colorful stuff, but their reasons were so completely different, and their interests were so different, their language was so different. So I kind of booked for my friend, right? They didn't talk back actually as well, and I got to find the kind of coterie of architects who maybe on paper actually just totally don't match at all, but I developed a relationship with them privately. And so I have a line of architects stretching back, you know, to, I don't know, probably, I don't know, Samarra in ancient Iraq, and in specific examples that have meaning for me. But it's quite rare to find something in contemporary architecture that I can develop that kind of relationship with. So to give you an example, in London, one of the places, but it's actually kind of, I guess, the one real place that actually I have that is Westminster Cathedral, which is not the Abbey. The Abbey is the kind of Gothic one from the 13th century. It's the early 20th century, late 19th century Catholic cathedral, right? Which was built in the Byzantine style, and it's kind of this giant unfinished mess. You know, half covered in mosaics, but never finished, and it's kind of full of immigrant communities for whom it's a very important community center, and it's just rammed with incense. And it's got these qualities that I personally relate to really, really well. But if I had to pick a designer, contemporary designer, if that was the question.
I don't know if it has to be contemporary designer, just who you currently, well, they just say currently in the news, so, but that may not apply.
I can't think. I like them.
Yeah.
maybe the ones I guess I maybe possibly really have some issues with some Bjarke Ingels stuff, but not really.
Yeah. What about another question from Daniel Smith? So how helpful do you see your time spent, quote, moving toilets around in Revit? I like that quote too. How helpful do you think that time has been for your current work? Did learning the boring world of architectural practice give you freedom today?
So it was a mixed bag. There's in a way. Oh, sorry. Is it working? My connection?
Yeah. We can see you and hear you. I can.
You can. Okay. Sorry, I lost you for a little bit.
Is it getting a bit?
So.
Yeah.
Oh. No. Yeah, you went a bit choppy for a while, and you've sort of.
I can hear you, but it might just be a little glitch in the.
Okay, am I back?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. What was the question again?
Just about your time spent moving around toilets in Revit. Do you think that time working in the more boring world of architectural practice gave you freedom today?
On the one hand, I think it taught me a lot, and I got to experience just how to be on projects, how to be a team player, how the profession worked, how to structure just I don't know the logistics of managing projects, incoming information, outgoing information, and deadlines. But at the same time, it also and I've spoken to there's quite a few queer people that I know. Obviously, this is the world I move in. This is I think it's probably the same with others, particularly people who don't fit in. But I did feel pushed out. So I did feel that there was absolutely, and it was reinforced every single day. There was no designer who wanted to do things in a slightly, very different way maybe, but there was absolutely no room for me as a designer, but like none. And it was reinforced constantly. And I got very depressed actually at various points. Which is why I ended up constantly doing stuff on the side, because I did feel my very being just withering away when I was there. Despite and I'm not a quiet person. This is not like somebody who mumbled something and then gave up. I always did put myself out there. And also the way I see women have spoken about how they get treated in meetings and stuff, and that was very much my experience. Being diminished constantly. So on the one hand, it was soul destroying, and very unpleasant. But on the other hand, actually, the people. So very often, for instance, the people doing these things are not evil. They're actually very nice, and you'll be friends with them. They don't know that they don't really understand what they're doing and the effect that it has. And actually, I was surrounded by really nice people, and. And I learned practical things, and got the opportunity to do those projects while I was earning that salary on the side that developed stuff. So it didn't pave the ground to everything being really easy at all afterwards. But it was another very important and very hard learned life lesson, which, as part of it, meant that in my practice, I would have loved to be an architect, but I just feel like pushed out of the profession. But in these sort of parallel interstitial spaces that I've managed to somehow claw out little moments of professional existence, the skills that I've learned are very valuable. And the fact that I've worked in those offices is something that I know clients respond to really well. Even the way that I speak, because I have an ability to speak the lingo as it were, and slot in a particular way to projects that people appreciate. So it's a mixed bag. Like, do I wish that I hadn't done it and I had chosen a different path? Yeah, but then again, what's the point of wondering?
Right. And
I remember, like, I was started to do my part 3. So RIBA part 3 is like getting accreditation in America.
Right.
I don't know about there, but here it's a very long process. You have to work for a few years in practice, and you have to build up a kind of body of work, and you get examined on it, and then you do a submission, and then you do an oral exam. And I started doing, and for instance, famously, like, Zaha failed it multiple times because it's basically a bunch of grumpy men being, and again, I say men, that's a horrible gendered way of putting down an entire sex, but it's a kind of that just old school British world.
Right.
Who's not even that old, but like representing a kind of group thing that sit there judging who can be part of the profession. And I started to do my part 3, and I ran a mile and had a very big fight to get my money back from the university. And it was a little bit like giving up a family, like a dream of having children and stuff, because obviously that was always the goal.
Yep.
And I just realized, and it was not just me, lots of people I know and my boyfriend at the same time, for different reasons, but because we variously didn't fit in different ways, we left.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that we weren't good. We were all top achievers at our various universities.
Right. There's just a couple of comments, and then I guess we're at time, but from El to say, I love this talk. Thank you so much for offering it. Your work is fantastic. Clapping. And Donna, such a great lecture, Adam. It's wonderful and inspiring to see how generous you are. I agree. It was a really, really, it's just beautiful work, but the way you spoke about it and some of the insights into your process and struggles and moving through that journey, I guess, was just fascinating. So thank you so much. Really great to have you with us at Cranbrook. There's our audience is very much, our students are very much in this world of, trying to navigate their own work and create a practice out of what they are inspired by, as opposed to, for some predestined profession at the end of it. So it's really been great that way too. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.